I hauled my duffel bag off the conveyor belt, the strap digging into my shoulder. London. I dreamed about this moment for years, but now that I was here, my stomach churned. The weather was as gray as I felt. Max, focus, I muttered, weaving through the crowd. Queen Murray University wasn't going to wait for me to find my bearings. My phone buzzed, my sister, Catherine, checking in as usual. You there yet? Yeah, just got my bag, I texted back, slipping my phone into my pocket as I stepped outside. The cold air hit me like a slap. The cab ride to the campus was a blur of historic buildings and crowded streets. My mind was elsewhere. Tomorrow, I'd be meeting my new classmates, maybe even him, David. Everyone at school couldn't stop talking about him. The golden boy. The thought made my heart race, and not just because he was popular. I checked into my dorm, tossed my bag on the bed, and let out a long breath. The room was small but cozy, with just enough space for me to feel like I wasn't suffocating. I sat down, staring out the window at the unfamiliar city. The excitement was there, but so was something else, a gnawing anxiety. There was a knock on the door. I opened it to a tall guy with a friendly grin. Hey, you must be Max. I'm Jack. Your dorm mate. His handshake was firm, but his eyes were warm. You settling in okay? Yeah, just getting started, I replied, trying to match his enthusiasm. Well, if you need anything, just shout. We're all meeting downstairs in a bit to grab a bite. You should join us. It's a good way to meet everyone. Sure, sounds good. As he left, I caught myself in the mirror. A mixture of nerves and excitement stared back at me. Tomorrow I'd face David for the first time, and I wasn't sure how I'd keep my cool. I turned back to my suitcase, unzipping it slowly. The real adventure was just beginning. The next morning I found myself sitting in a lecture hall, staring at the empty seat beside me, hoping and dreading that David might sit there. My heart thudded in my chest like a drum, loud enough that I was sure the people next to me could hear it. I was early. Of course I was. Always early, always prepared. It was a habit that came from overcompensating. I never quite felt like I belonged, and being punctual was my safety net. Students began trickling in, a steady flow of chatter filling the room. I fiddled with my pen, glancing up every few seconds, pretending to read the course syllabus on my laptop, but really scanning the crowd. Then, like a ripple through the room, a presence. David. He walked in like he owned the place. Tall, confident, his eyes scanning the hall like he was looking for something or someone. He was the kind of guy you couldn't help but notice. Broad shoulders, sharp jawline, hair perfectly tousled, like he just rolled out of bed and still looked better than anyone. His eyes locked onto mine for half a second, but it was enough to send a jolt through me. I quickly looked away, pretending to be engrossed in my screen. Hey, is this seat taken? His voice was deeper than I expected, smooth, with just the right amount of curiosity. I looked up, and there he was, standing over me, waiting for an answer. And no, go ahead, I stammered, mentally kicking myself for sounding so awkward. David slid into the seat next to me, his presence overpowering. He smelled like mint and something else, something I couldn't place but was immediately drawn to. I kept my focus on the screen, trying not to fidget. So, you're Max, right? He turned slightly in his chair, giving me his full attention. Jack told me about you. New exchange student from Turkey, right? Yeah, that's me, I replied, trying to sound casual, like sitting next to the most popular guy at school wasn't completely throwing me off balance. He smiled, and it was the kind of smile that could melt ice. Cool. I heard you're in my anthropology group. Of course I knew that already, but hearing him say it made it feel more real, like this wasn't some distant rumor. We'd be working together. Close, for weeks. Yeah, looking forward to it, I said, my voice finally steady. Same here, he said, leaning back in his chair, relaxed, like this was all just another normal day for him. For me, it was the beginning of something I hadn't even fully wrapped my head around yet. The professor entered, starting the lecture, but I couldn't focus. Every time David shifted in his seat, his arm brushing against mine, it sent little sparks through me. I tried to focus on the lecture, the notes, anything but him. When class ended, David stood up and stretched, catching my attention once again. Hey, a few of us are getting together tonight to work on the group project. You in? Yeah, sure, I replied, trying to play it cool, but inside my heart was racing. "Cool," he said with that same effortless grin. "See you at 7 then." As he walked away, I couldn't help but think, this is it. The start of something. What exactly? I had no idea. But one thing was certain, I wasn't just another face in the crowd to him anymore. That evening I showed up at the student lounge a few minutes before 7, nerves buzzing in my veins. The place was packed, students huddled in groups, some working, some laughing over drinks. I scanned the room, and there he was, sitting with a couple of others, casually leaning back in his chair, talking like he owned the space. David spotted me and waved me over, making me feel like I belonged for the first time since I'd landed in London. I joined the group, trying not to let my nerves show. "Max," "Hey," David said, flashing that same smile that had caught me off guard earlier. "This is Carol, Jack, and David, the other David." "Hey," I nodded, trying to memorize names, but my mind was mostly focused on him, David, the one who made me feel like my pulse was stuck on high. "All right, let's get this going," Jack said, pulling out a notebook. "We've got a presentation to crush." The group settled into work, but my attention drifted toward David more often than I wanted to admit. He was sharp, throwing out ideas, making connections that I hadn't even considered. He had this way of speaking that made everything sound easy, like he already had it all figured out. At one point, we both reached for the same paper, our hands brushing. I pulled back quickly, but David just chuckled. "You all right there, Max?" he asked, his eyes locking onto mine, playful but curious. "Yeah, sorry," I muttered, feeling the heat rise in my cheeks. I focused back on the notes, desperate to calm the sudden rush of awkwardness. As the night wore on, I started to relax. The group's energy was contagious, and soon we were bouncing ideas back and forth like we'd been doing this for years. I found myself laughing at Carol's jokes, offering suggestions that made Jack nod in approval. For once, I wasn't just the new guy, I was part of the team. David, though, he kept surprising me. He was brilliant, but he wasn't arrogant about it. He listened, asked questions, and didn't make me feel small when I threw out an idea that wasn't quite there yet. As the conversation lulled, Carol and Jack started packing up their things. "We should call it a night," Jack said, standing up. "Same time tomorrow." "Yeah, sounds good," David replied, glancing at me as the others left. I fumbled with my notebook, trying to figure out if I should leave too, but David stayed seated, his eyes still on me. "You did good tonight," he said, his voice lower now that the others were gone. "I wasn't sure what to expect, but you've got some solid ideas." "Thanks," I said, feeling a swell of pride that caught me off guard. Compliments from him felt like they carried more weight. "You're kind of intimidating, you know that." He raised an eyebrow, leaning forward just a little. "Me?" Intimidating, his lips curled into a small smile. "I think you're the first person to ever say that to me." I laughed, shaking my head. "Yeah, right, you walk into a room and everyone notices. How's that not intimidating?" David shrugged, still smiling, but his eyes softened. "People make too much of that stuff. Half the time, I'm just trying to keep it together like everyone else." He paused, his gaze steady on me. "You're different, though. Most people don't even bother trying to get past the surface." I swallowed, caught off guard by the sudden shift. "What do you mean?" "You're not like the others," he said, his tone quieter now. "You don't just follow the crowd. I can see that." I didn't know how to respond to that, so I didn't. Instead, I just sat there, letting the moment hang between us. For the first time, it didn't feel like I was just some guy in David's orbit. It felt like I was someone he actually saw. "Anyway," David said, standing up and breaking the tension with a grin. "Same time tomorrow." I nodded, getting to my feet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something between us had shifted. He walked me to the door, and just as I was about to leave, he added, "See you tomorrow, Max." It wasn't just the words. It was the way he said them, like he actually meant it. Like he was looking forward to it. I stepped out into the cool night air, my heart racing, knowing that this was just the beginning. The next night we met again, same time, same place. The group got to work quickly, but the energy was different this time, at least for me. David's comment from the night before kept replaying in my head. "You're different. You don't just follow the crowd." It left me feeling seen in a way I wasn't used to. We worked through the presentation plan, and slowly, one by one, the others began to filter out. Carol left first, followed by Jack and the other David, until it was just the two of us again, sitting side by side in the lounge. The quiet that settled around us felt heavier than before. I tried to focus on the papers in front of me, but all I could think about was how close he was. David stretched, yawning a little, then glanced over at me. "You all right, Max? You've been kind of quiet tonight." I looked up, surprised he'd noticed. "Yeah, just tired, I guess." He nodded, but his eyes lingered on me. "We've been at this for hours. You want to take a break?" Before I could answer, he stood up and stretched again. "Come on, let's grab something to drink," he said, gesturing for me to follow. We ended up in the common area where a vending machine hummed softly. He handed me a soda without asking what I wanted, and I just laughed at the simplicity of it. We leaned against the wall, the soft murmur of late-night conversations in the background. "You're adjusting well here," David said, taking a sip of his drink. "I'm trying," I replied, grateful for the casual conversation. It's been different, but good. He studied me for a moment, as if weighing his next words carefully. "You ever feel like you're not sure where you fit in? Like everything around you is moving fast and you're just trying to catch up?" I blinked, surprised. That wasn't what I expected from him. Yeah, all the time, actually. He nodded like he knew exactly what I meant. "People think I've got it all figured out, but it's not that simple. Sometimes I'm just tired of keeping up appearances, you know." "Why do you do it?" then I asked before I could stop myself. David paused, looking at me with an intensity that made my breath catch. "Sometimes it's just easier to be who people expect you to be." But he hesitated, eyes flickering down to the floor before meeting mine again. "Sometimes you meet someone who makes you want to be yourself." I felt the air shift between us. The noise from the common area seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the two of us. I could feel my pulse in my throat, my palms starting to sweat. David was closer than he'd ever been before. He didn't move at first, just stood there, watching me like he was waiting for something. My head was swimming, the quiet tension building between us, until I couldn't take it anymore. "What are you thinking?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked at me, then stepped closer, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from him. His voice was low, almost a murmur. "I think you already know." And then, before I could respond, his hand reached out, brushing against my arm light at first, like he was testing the waters. I didn't pull away. I couldn't. His fingers traced up to my shoulder, his touch sending a shiver down my spine. He leaned in, his breath warm against my neck. "Tell me if you want me to stop," he whispered. I didn't say anything. I didn't want him to stop. In one smooth movement, his lips found mine, and everything else melted away: the room, the noise, the world outside. There was only David. The kiss was tentative at first, like he wasn't sure how far to go, but when I responded, he pressed closer, deepening it. His hands slid down my arms, pulling me into him, and I could feel his heart racing against my chest. We pulled apart, both of us breathless. He looked at me, his blue eyes dark with something more than just attraction. I shouldn't have done that, he said, but there was no regret in his voice. I swallowed hard, my mind spinning. "Why did you?" David hesitated, his eyes searching mine. "Because I couldn't stop myself." Silence hung in the air, thick and heavy. My heart pounded in my chest, but I didn't know what to say. Everything between us had shifted in an instant, and I wasn't sure how to handle it. David stepped back, running a hand through his hair. "Look, Max, I don't know what this means. I didn't plan it." I didn't either, I admitted. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. His jaw clenched, a flicker of conflict crossing his face. "We should probably get back," he said, his tone forced, like he was trying to regain control. Yeah, I nodded, though neither of us moved. The moment lingered a second longer before David turned and walked toward the door. I followed, my mind still reeling from what had just happened. We didn't say much as we gathered our things, the weight of that kiss hanging between us, unspoken but undeniable. As we left the lounge, David glanced over at me one last time. "See you tomorrow?" he asked, his voice softer now. "Yeah," I replied, though I knew nothing would be the same after tonight. As I walked back to my dorm alone, my lips still tingling from his kiss, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of what, I wasn't sure yet. But one thing was certain: I was in deep, and there was no going back. The next morning I woke up with the memory of David's kiss still vivid, like it had just happened. I lay there for a few minutes, staring at the ceiling, replaying every second in my mind, the way he touched me, the way he looked at me. But as reality started to settle in, so did the questions. What did it mean? Was it just a moment of weakness for him? Or something more? I rolled out of bed and got ready, my mind racing. Today I'd see him again, and I had no idea how to act, pretend like nothing happened, or acknowledge it. By the time I made it to the lecture hall, my heart was pounding. I walked in, scanning the room for him. There he was, sitting with his usual group, talking and laughing like it was any other day, like last night hadn't changed anything. I hesitated for a moment, then sat down a few rows behind him, pretending to focus on my notes. I stole a glance his way, but he didn't look back. Not once. My stomach twisted, uncertainty gnawing at me. Maybe I had imagined more into it than I should have. Maybe to him, it was just a random, heat-of-the-moment thing. The class dragged on, the professor's voice a distant hum as I watched David from the corner of my eye. He seemed perfectly fine, relaxed even. No sign of the intensity from last night. I couldn't figure him out, and it was driving me crazy. After class, I packed up my things slowly, hoping for some kind of sign from him. But David left without even glancing in my direction, walking out with his friends, his laughter echoing through the hallway. I stood there, frozen, feeling like an idiot. Did it mean nothing to him? "Max, you coming to the study session tonight?" Jack's voice snapped me out of my thoughts. He was waiting by the door, looking at me like I'd spaced out. Yeah, I'll be there," I muttered, forcing a smile. "Cool, see you at 7. I nodded and walked out, my mind still racing. Maybe David was just being cautious. Maybe he didn't want to act any different in front of his friends, but deep down I couldn't shake the doubt that maybe last night was just a mistake to him. That evening I found myself back in the student lounge, surrounded by the group. David showed up late, sliding into his chair with a casual hey like nothing was out of the ordinary. My stomach clenched, and I forced myself to focus on the task at hand, project planning, not overthinking his every move. As the group worked, David was as sharp and engaged as ever, throwing out ideas, making everyone laugh. I tried to act normal, but my mind kept drifting back to the night before, wondering if I should say something. Should I ask him about it? Should I bring it up? We finished the session, and again, everyone began to leave one by one. This time, David lingered behind as the others walked out. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. This was my chance to talk to him, to clear the air. But before I could say anything, he beat me to it. "Max, about last night." His voice was low, his eyes finally meeting mine. I froze, unsure of what was coming next. I didn't mean to. Complicate things. He rubbed the back of his neck, his usual confidence faltering for the first time. "It just happened. I don't want things to be weird between us." Weird? My stomach twisted. Was that all it was to him? Something that just happened? I forced a smile, trying to play it cool. "Yeah, I get it, no worries." But inside, I felt the sting of disappointment. I'd been hoping for something more, some kind of acknowledgement that it wasn't just a random moment, that maybe it meant something. But David was already pulling back, retreating into the safety of nonchalance. He gave me a quick nod, relief flickering across his face. "Good, I'm glad we're on the same page." The same page? Hardly. But I wasn't about to push it. Not yet. We walked out together, the tension between us lingering but unspoken. As we reached the door, David glanced over at me. "See you tomorrow." "Yeah," I replied, though the word felt hollow. I watched him walk away, feeling more confused than ever. Last night had felt like a turning point, like something real. But now it was clear that David wasn't ready to face it, or maybe he didn't want to. I wasn't sure which was worse. Back in my room, I collapsed onto the bed, staring at the ceiling again. The excitement of that kiss had faded, replaced by a gnawing uncertainty. Did I mean something to him, or was I just another secret he could brush aside when it suited him? I turned off the light, trying to push the thoughts out of my mind, but as I lay there in the dark, all I could think about was David and how nothing would ever be simple between us. The days that followed were a blur of mixed signals and tension. David was everywhere, showing up at study sessions, sitting next to me in class, acting like everything was normal. But every so often, I'd catch him looking at me, his gaze lingering a little too long before he looked away. It was like he couldn't make up his mind. I tried to play it cool, keeping my distance while pretending I wasn't constantly thinking about him. But it was hard. The kiss from that night still haunted me, and every time our eyes met, I felt that same pull. "Max, you with us?" Carol's voice broke through my thoughts. We were at another study session, but I'd been distracted. Again. "Yeah, sorry," I muttered, quickly flipping through my notes. David was sitting across from me, leaning back in his chair, casually watching the exchange. His lips curled into a small smile, like he knew exactly where my head was at. As the session wrapped up, Jack and Carol packed their things, but David lingered. It had become a pattern. He'd hang back, waiting for the others to leave, but never saying much. Just being there, hovering like he couldn't quite let go of whatever was between us, but wasn't ready to confront it either. Tonight was no different. The room emptied, and there we were, just the two of us. Again. I stood up, ready to leave, when David spoke. "You heading out already?" I paused, glancing back at him. "Yeah, it's late." He shrugged, looking almost disappointed, then stood up as well. "Walk with me." I hesitated for a second, then nodded. "Sure." We stepped out into the cool night air, walking side by side through the quiet campus. The tension between us was thick, but neither of us spoke. I didn't know where this was going, if it was going anywhere at all. David broke the silence first. "About the other night, I've been thinking." My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't sure if I wanted to hear what he had to say. "I didn't mean to act like it didn't matter," he continued, his voice quieter now, more vulnerable than I'd ever heard it. "It did. I don't know how to handle this." I stopped walking, turning to face him. "Handle what?" He stopped too, running a hand through his hair. You, us. Whatever this is," his voice was tight, like he was fighting to get the words out. "It's not that I don't want it, it's just complicated." I stared at him, frustration bubbling up. "Complicated how? You either want this or you don't, David." He winced, his jaw clenching. "You don't get it, Max. It's not that simple for me." "Then explain it," I shot back, my patience wearing thin. "Because from where I'm standing, it feels like you're just playing games. You kiss me, then act like nothing happened. You say it matters, but then you don't want to talk about it. What am I supposed to think?" David's eyes flashed with something, guilt, maybe. "I'm not trying to mess with you," he said quietly. I don't know how to deal with this without everything changing." I took a deep breath, trying to calm the anger rising in my chest. "What are you so afraid of?" He hesitated, then looked away, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm afraid of losing control, of what people will think. I'm supposed to be the guy who has it all together. I can't." He stopped, swallowing hard. "I can't be that guy and be with you. Not publicly." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. There it was, the truth I'd been dreading. "So what?" I asked, my voice tight. "You want to keep this, whatever this is, a secret? You want me to hide so you can keep up your image?" David didn't answer, but the look on his face said it all. I shook my head, stepping back. "That's not fair, David, to either of us." "I know," he said, his voice raw. "I know it's not. But I don't know what else to do." For a moment we just stood there, the weight of the conversation hanging heavy between us. The push and pull, the constant back and forth, it was exhausting. And yet, I couldn't walk away. Not yet. I looked him in the eye, my voice steady. "I'm not going to be your secret." David flinched, his expression pained. "I'm not asking you to be. I just need time. I need to figure this out." I wanted to believe him, but part of me wasn't sure if he'd ever figure it out. Part of me wasn't sure if I could wait for him to. I sighed, the fight draining out of me. "I don't know if I can keep doing this, David." The back and forth. The games. You need to decide what you really want. He didn't respond right away. just looked at me with those conflicted blue eyes, like he was caught in a war between what he wanted and what he thought he could have. "I don't want to lose you," he said finally, his voice breaking. "But I'm scared, Max. I'm scared of what this could mean for me." I looked away, the frustration and sadness weighing down on me. "You're not the only one scared, David, but at some point you have to make a choice." Silence fell between us, heavy and unresolved. I didn't wait for him to say more. I turned and walked away, my chest tight with a mix of anger, hurt, and something I couldn't quite name. As I made my way back to my dorm, I knew one thing for sure: nothing was going to be simple with David. It was always going to be a push and pull, a fight between his fears and what we could be, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could hold on. But part of me, a part one didn't want to admit, wasn't ready to let go yet. A few days passed after our conversation, and things between David and me were strained. I tried to stay focused on classes, on our group project, on anything that didn't involve thinking about him. But every time I saw him, even in the smallest moments, like passing him in the hallway or sitting across from him in class, I could feel the weight of everything left unsaid between us. He wasn't the same either. He kept his distance, avoided hanging around after group meetings like he used to. The casual touches, the lingering looks, those were gone. It was like he was trying to create space between us, to put up a wall. But every so often I'd catch him watching me when he thought I wasn't looking. That look, the one that said he wanted more but didn't know how to reach for it. It was torture. One night we had another group meeting for the project. Everyone was there, but the atmosphere was tense. David and I hadn't really talked since that night, and the unspoken tension between us was thick enough that even Jack and Carol seemed to pick up on it. "All right," Jack said, stretching his arms above his head. "I think we've got most of this sorted. Let's meet again tomorrow and fine-tune everything. Cool." Everyone nodded, and Carol was the first to leave. Jack hung back for a second, glancing between David and me before shrugging and heading out himself. I gathered my notes, ready to bolt before things got awkward, but David stood up suddenly. "Max, wait," he said, his voice low but firm. I froze, heart pounding in my chest, knowing that this moment had been coming. Slowly, I turned to face him. "We need to talk," he said, running a hand through his hair, a nervous habit I'd noticed whenever he was struggling with something. "I've been thinking about what you said, about needing to make a choice." I stayed silent, waiting for him to continue. David took a deep breath, stepping closer. "I don't want to lose you, but I'm scared of what this could mean for me. For everything I've built here, my friends, my reputation. They expect me to be a certain way. I've always been the guy who has it all together, you know, the one who doesn't mess up, who plays the part perfectly. Being with you, it's not what anyone would expect from me." My chest tightened, frustration bubbling to the surface again. "So what? You're going to keep pretending? Keep hiding?" David's eyes flashed with something, maybe guilt, maybe fear. "It's not that simple, Max. You don't understand." No, I cut him off, my voice sharper than I intended. "I do understand. You're scared of what people will think. You're scared of losing your image. But what about me, David? What about how I feel? I can't keep doing this waiting for you to decide if you're brave enough to let people know about us, if you even want there to be an us." David opened his mouth to respond, but I kept going, the words pouring out before I could stop them. "I'm not asking you to make some grand announcement, but I'm not going to be your secret either. You either want to be with me, or you don't. And if you don't, just tell me. Stop dragging me through this mess." David flinched, like my words had hit him harder than he expected. He looked away, jaw clenched, and for a moment, I thought he was going to walk away. But then, to my surprise, he spoke, his voice low and rough. "I don't know if I can be the guy you need." The admission hung in the air, heavy and painful. It felt like a punch to the gut, and for a second, I couldn't breathe. This was it, the moment I'd been dreading. But then he took a step closer, his eyes locking onto mine. "But I want to be." I blinked, caught off guard by the sudden shift. "What are you saying, David?" "I'm saying." He hesitated, like he wasn't sure if he should continue, but then his shoulders straightened, and he looked me dead in the eye. "I'm saying I don't want to hide this anymore. I don't want to keep pretending like nothing's happening between us. I'm just scared of how to make it work." I stared at him, my heart pounding in my chest. Part of me wanted to believe him, to grab onto the hope he was offering. But another part of me, an exhausted, wounded part, wasn't sure if I could trust it. "You've said that before," I muttered, my voice softer now, the anger draining out of me. "But then you always pull away." "I know," David admitted, stepping even closer until we were almost touching. "I know I've been all over the place. I've been terrified of what people will think, of losing everything. But I'm more terrified of losing you." My throat tightened, the words hitting deeper than I expected. I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't shake the doubt that had taken root over the past few weeks. "I need to know if you're serious, David. If you really want this, or if it's just another moment you'll back away from when things get hard." He didn't answer right away, just stood there, staring at me like he was searching for the right words. Then, in a quiet voice, he said, "I want this, Max. I don't know how to do it yet, but I know I want it. I want you." The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard. For the first time, he wasn't just playing it cool or trying to avoid the conversation. He was being real, vulnerable in a way I hadn't seen before. And that vulnerability did something to me. It cracked through the walls I'd been putting up, just a little. I didn't say anything, just nodded, letting the moment sink in. David watched me for a second, then stepped even closer, his hand brushing against mine. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a promise. "I'm not asking you to wait forever," he said quietly, his fingers barely touching mine. "Just give me a little more time. I'm trying, Max. I swear I am." I took a deep breath, feeling the tension between us shift again, this time in a way that didn't feel like a tug of war. It felt more like a tentative step toward something real, something worth fighting for. "All right," I said finally, my voice steady, "but I'm not going to keep doing this back and forth. If you want me, then show me, don't just tell me." David nodded, his expression serious, like he understood how much was riding on this. "I will." For the first time in weeks, I felt like we were on the same page. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't simple, but it was real, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start building something that could last. We walked out of the lounge together, side by side, not saying much, but not needing to. For now, that small step felt like enough. The next couple of days were a strange mix of tension and cautious optimism. David seemed more present, more deliberate. He wasn't hiding anymore, at least not when it was just the two of us. We'd still exchange glances in class, still brush shoulders when we walked side by side, but something had shifted. There was an unspoken agreement between us, a promise that things were moving forward. Slowly, but forward. Then came the party. It was one of those big campus events that everyone was talking about, something thrown together by the student council. Jack, being Jack, was hyped about it and wouldn't stop bugging me to come. I wasn't really the party type, but after everything that had happened between David and me, I figured maybe I needed the distraction. Plus, David was going to be there. He hadn't said anything outright, but I knew he would be. When I arrived, the music was already thumping, the bass vibrating through the walls. The place was packed, students dancing, drinking, spilling out onto the balcony. I scanned the room, half hoping, half dreading to see David. I found him almost immediately, surrounded by the usual crowd. He was leaning against the bar, laughing with a couple of his friends, looking as effortlessly cool as ever. For a moment I just stood there, watching him, wondering where I fit into that world of his. Jack spotted me first. "Max, finally, man, thought you were going to bail." "Not tonight," I said, forcing a smile. My eyes flicked to David again. He hadn't noticed me yet, or maybe he was pretending not to. Either way, I wasn't about to make the first move. Not here. I grabbed a drink and tried to relax, but it was hard to ignore the knot in my stomach. Part of me wanted to go over to him, to act like we were just two normal guys figuring things out. But another part of me, the more cautious, self-preserving part, was waiting for him to make the move, to see if he'd acknowledge what we were becoming in front of everyone else. As the night wore on, I caught glimpses of him across the room. Sometimes I thought he was looking at me, but every time I tried to catch his eye, someone would pull him into another conversation. Another laugh. Another drink. It was starting to feel like maybe I didn't belong here after all. I was about to leave when something changed. A group of guys, clearly drunk, started shouting over the music. They were joking, roughhousing, nothing out of the ordinary for a college party. But then I heard one of them say David's name. My attention snapped to them. And I realized they were talking about him, about how every girl on campus wanted him, about how he could have anyone he wanted. One of the guys clapped David on the back. "So, what's your secret, man? Who's the lucky girl you've been hiding?" David laughed it off, but I saw the flash of discomfort in his eyes. He was cornered, surrounded by his friends, all eyes on him. I could feel the tension radiating from him, the way he shifted uneasily. I watched, waiting to see how he'd respond. This was it. This was the moment where he either stepped up or fell back into the shadows, and I needed to know which. One of the guys kept pushing. "Come on, David, we've all seen you sneaking off lately. You got someone or what?" David's gaze flicked across the room, and for a split second, our eyes met. It was a brief moment, but I saw the panic there, the fear of being exposed. Then he looked away, smiling tightly as he clapped the guy on the shoulder. "Nah, nothing like that. Just busy with classes, you know." My stomach dropped. He hadn't denied me outright, but he hadn't claimed me either. He'd taken the easy way out, just like before. And this time it hurt more than I expected. I put my drink down, the noise of the party fading into the background as I made my way toward the door. I couldn't stay here, not after that. I needed air or space, something to stop the crushing disappointment settling in my chest. I was almost outside when I heard someone call my name. I turned to see David pushing through the crowd, his face tight with something that wasn't quite panic but close enough. "Max, wait," he said, grabbing my arm before I could leave. "Can we talk?" I shook my head, pulling my arm free. "Talk? About what, David? You had your chance in there." He looked around, checking if anyone was watching, then lowered his voice. "Not here, not like this." "Why not?" I snapped, anger bubbling up. "Because someone might hear? Because it might ruin your perfect image." David winced, his jaw clenching. "It's not about that." "Then what is it about?" I demanded, my voice rising. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're still too scared to admit what's going on between us. You just told your friends nothing was happening. That's your answer, David. That's your choice." His face tightened, frustration and guilt mixing in his expression. "I didn't mean it like that. I'm not ready for everyone to know. It's not that simple, Max." I stared at him, my heart pounding. "It's never going to be simple, David. But if you can't even acknowledge me in front of your friends, then what are we even doing?" He opened his mouth to respond, but I didn't give him the chance. I turned and walked out, my pulse racing, my head spinning. I didn't stop until I was outside, the cold air hitting my face like a slap. I leaned against the wall, breathing hard, trying to calm down. But the truth was, I wasn't just angry, I was hurt, deeply. I'd given him time, I'd given him space, and he still couldn't meet me halfway. I heard footsteps behind me, and before I could turn, David's voice cut through the quiet. "Max, I'm sorry." I didn't respond, didn't even look at him. I couldn't trust myself to speak without everything spilling out in a rush of emotion. "I screwed up," he continued, his voice softer now, raw. "I should have said something in there. I should have been honest. But I'm trying, okay? I'm trying to figure this out. I want to be with you, Max. I just need more time." I closed my eyes, letting his words sink in. I wanted to believe him, but I wasn't sure if I could keep waiting. "I don't know if I can keep doing this," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "You say you want this, but every time it matters, you pull away." David stepped closer, and I could feel the heat of him beside me. "I'm not pulling away this time," he said quietly. "I'm here. I'm standing right here. And I'm not leaving until you believe me." I turned to look at him, and for the first time I saw it, real fear, real vulnerability. He wasn't just scared of what people would think. He was scared of losing me. And that, more than anything, made me pause. "Then prove it," I whispered. David nodded, his eyes steady on mine. "I will." David didn't hesitate. The next morning I found a message from him: "Meet me outside the library at noon. I want to talk." Something about the tone was different, determined. I wasn't sure if I was ready for what he had to say, but I had to find out. I showed up at the library just before noon, leaning against the stone wall, trying to stay calm. A few minutes later, David appeared, walking toward me with purpose, his expression serious but calm. He wasn't hiding. Not today. "Hey," he said, stopping in front of me. "Hey," I replied, my heart thudding in my chest. This wasn't like our usual encounters, this felt bigger. David took a breath and looked around. The campus was busy as usual, people milling about, heading to class or hanging out. He seemed to take stock of the crowd, then turned back to me. "I've been thinking a lot since last night," he began, his voice steady. "It's about everything. About us." I folded my arms, bracing myself, and he stepped closer, lowering his voice but making sure it was still clear. "I'm done hiding." The words hit me like a punch. My pulse quickened, but I kept my expression neutral, waiting for him to continue. "I can't do it anymore, Max," he said, his eyes locking on mine. "I've been so afraid of what everyone would think, of how it might change everything. But the truth is, not having you, that's worse. That's what I've been most afraid of." I blinked, unsure of what to say. For weeks I'd been waiting to hear him say something like this, but now that he was standing here, making this confession in front of everyone, it didn't feel real. David looked around again. Then, before I could react, he did something I never expected him to do, not in front of everyone. He reached for my hand. The shock must have shown on my face, because he gave me a small, almost apologetic smile. "I know I've messed this up," he said quietly, squeezing my hand just enough for me to feel the warmth of his skin. "I know I've hurt you by pulling back, and I don't expect you to just forget that. But I'm here right now doing what I should have done a long time ago." I glanced around, half expecting people to be staring, but they weren't. A few students passed by, maybe noticing, maybe not, but no one said anything. The world didn't stop, it didn't implode, it just kept going. I looked back at David, my chest tight. "You sure about this?" David nodded, his expression more serious than I'd ever seen it. "Yeah," I'm sure. He paused, searching my face for a sign. "I don't want to lose you, Max, and if this is what it takes, then I'm all in." The honesty in his voice was undeniable. This wasn't the guarded, conflicted David I'd been dealing with for weeks. This was real, and I realized, in that moment, that I wasn't ready to give up on him either. I took a breath, letting the tension drain out of me. "Okay." His grip on my hand tightened, relief flashing across his face. He opened his mouth to say something else, but just then, Jack and Carol appeared, heading toward us. They slowed when they saw us, their eyes flicking from me to David's hand in mine. I tensed, waiting for the reaction, but Jack just raised an eyebrow and smirked. Finally, he said, laughing as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. Carol grinned, throwing her arm around Jack's shoulder. "Took you guys long enough." David glanced at me, a mixture of amusement and disbelief on his face. I could tell he hadn't expected this reaction. Neither had I. The anxiety I'd been carrying for weeks, the fear of what everyone would say, began to dissolve in that moment. "Thanks, guys," David said, laughing softly, though I could hear the edge of relief in his voice. They waved us off and continued walking, their conversation already shifting to something else, like the sight of us together was no big deal. As they disappeared into the crowd, David turned back to me, his eyes softer now. "So what now?" he asked, still holding onto my hand. I smiled, feeling lighter than I had in a long time. "I guess we figure it out." David nodded, and for the first time in weeks, the tension between us was gone. No more hiding, no more pulling back, just us, out in the open. We walked through campus together, side by side, not caring who saw, not caring what they thought. And for the first time I realized that the fear I'd been holding on to, the fear of what might happen if people knew, wasn't as powerful as I thought. In the end, all that really mattered was this: David had chosen me and I had chosen him. And that was enough. In the days that followed, everything felt surreal. Walking across campus with David, hand in hand, wasn't the earth-shattering event I'd imagined it would be. The whispers were there, sure, but they didn't sting the way I feared. Most people didn't seem to care. The world didn't stop because David and I were together. We had lunch in the cafeteria like everyone else, hung out with Jack and Carol like nothing had changed. Except, of course, everything had changed. The weight that had been sitting on my chest for weeks was gone, replaced by this strange mix of freedom and relief. And David. He was different too. Lighter, more at ease, like he wasn't carrying the same burden anymore. But not everything was easy. We were sitting on the lawn one afternoon, just talking and enjoying the rare London sun, when one of David's friends from the basketball team, Chris, walked by. I could see it happen in real time. Chris's eyes locked on our hands, still loosely intertwined on the grass, and his face twisted with something that wasn't quite disgust but wasn't friendly either. "Yo, David," Chris called, his tone casual, but there was an edge to it. "Didn't expect to see you. Like this." David's grip on my hand tightened, just for a second. I held my breath, waiting to see what he'd do. Would he pull away? Laugh it off? Pretend like it wasn't what it looked like? But he didn't. Instead, he just looked up at Chris and shrugged. "Yeah, well, this is me now." There was no anger in his voice, no apology. Just a simple statement of fact. Chris stood there for a moment, clearly thrown off by David's calm response. He muttered something under his breath and walked away, leaving us in peace. David exhaled slowly, and I realized he'd been holding his breath too. "You okay?" I asked, studying his face. He looked relaxed, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the tightness around his eyes. David nodded, though his jaw was clenched. Yeah, I knew not everyone would be cool with it. I squeezed his hand. "You don't have to do this alone." He turned to me, his expression softening. "I know, and that's what makes it easier." The rest of the day passed quietly, but the moment with Chris stuck with me. It reminded me that, while David and I were figuring this out, there would always be people who wouldn't get it, people who'd have their opinions, their judgments. But what mattered was how we handled it together. The next big test came a few days later during a campus basketball game. David was one of the star players, and the entire team was gearing up for the match. I had never been much into sports, but I found myself sitting in the bleachers, watching as the crowd cheered and chanted his name. He was in his element, commanding the court with ease and precision. By halftime, the team was ahead, and the energy in the gym was electric. I watched as David high-fived his teammates, the usual easy smile on his face. But then, his eyes found me in the crowd, and for a moment, everything else seemed to disappear. After the game, people flooded the court, congratulating the players. I stayed off to the side, not wanting to intrude on his moment. But David didn't stay with his team for long. He walked straight over to me, sweat still clinging to his skin, his face flushed from the game. "Hey," he said, grinning. "Hey yourself," I replied, unable to hide my own smile. "You were amazing out there." He glanced around, his teammates still celebrating, then turned back to me. Without hesitation, he reached for my hand, pulling me closer, right there in front of everyone. The chatter around us quieted for a second, but I didn't care. Neither did he. "Thanks," he said, squeezing my hand. "I wanted you here." I felt a rush of warmth at his words. It wasn't just that he wasn't hiding anymore, it was that he wanted people to see. He wasn't afraid of what they thought. And for the first time, neither was I. We walked out of the gym together, side by side, David's arm resting casually around my shoulders. People stared, some whispered, but no one said anything. And if they did, I didn't hear it. All I could focus on was him. As we stepped outside, the cool night air hit us, and David pulled me closer. "You know, I was scared shitless when this all started," he admitted, his voice quiet now. "But being with you, it's worth it, all of it." I leaned into him, my chest tight with something that felt a lot like happiness. "I'm glad you figured that out," I teased, but there was no edge to it, just relief. David laughed softly, then turned serious again. "I know it's not always going to be easy. There's still going to be people like Chris, people who don't get it." "Yeah," I agreed. "But we'll deal with them. Together." He nodded, his gaze steady on mine. Together. We walked into the night, the campus behind us, and I realized that this was our new normal. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't always going to be smooth. But it was real. David had chosen me, and I had chosen him. And for the first time, I wasn't scared anymore.